7 titles. What the first farmer thought. While waiting. Boring farmer. The field was dim when the first farmer opened his eyes, though to say he opened them is almost too quick a motion. They unfurled, slow as mist lifting from a river stone, revealing a gaze already set upon the eastern sky. Nothing stirred but the faint blue promise of light. He lay for a moment longer on the earthen mat of reeds he had woven seasons ago, breathing as though his lungs were part of the soil beneath him, filling and emptying with the vast patience of the land itself. No alarm jarred him, no distant clatter pulled him upright. Only the quiet pulse of unborn wheat and the memory of last year's barley coaxed him to rise, and even that whisper took its time. Before moving forward, if you've been walking these quiet fields with me tonight, stay a little longer. There's always another story waiting like a seed beneath the soil. You can plant your own thoughts in the comments. I'll tend to them with care. And if you wish to return, you need only follow the path back here, like the sun finding the same horizon every morning. Subscribe, and the gate to this little village will always be open for you. Now let's get back to story. When he did move, it was the way water leans against a bank. Leaning, and finally, with no sense of hurry, accepting the next shape. He knelt and pressed one palm to the ground outside his shelter of timber posts and packed earth walls. The dirt was cool, almost weightless against the worn pads of his fingers. He lingered there, listening with the hand rather than the ear, waiting for any message the deep black beneath might send upward. Once, not long ago, he had believed messages would come loudly, signs of divine favor, thunderous pronouncements of harvests to come. But seasons teach, they peel away impatience as dew peels from leaf. Now he knew that the earth spoke in the language of subtle temperature shifts, in the faint yielding of clods, in breaths of hidden moisture. And if no voice arrived, that too was a kind of speaking. He rose by degrees, unfurling his spine until he stood upright beside the silent hut, and in that uprightness he felt the faint ache of age. It was not pain, rather a hum of remembered work, of baskets lifted, of stones gathered from rows. He welcomed the hum. It grounded him in his body like roots ground a tree. Stretching his arms to the sky, he sensed first light gather at the edges of the valley, still hesitant, still gray. A small curve of cloud drifted above the rising place of the sun, pale as unripe grain. He tasted the dawn on his tongue, cool, metallic, touched with the memory of distant mountain ice. His footsteps toward the waiting field were soft, almost ceremonial. He carried no tool this morning, for this was not a day for carving furrows. Today, like yesterday, and perhaps like tomorrow, was a day given entirely to waiting. Waiting not as idleness but as practice, as craft. The bronze-bladed sickle leaned against the hut wall, its edge resting after earlier labors, darkened by oils he had pressed from flaxseed to keep the metal from rust. The digging stick lay nearby, polished smooth by his palms, but untouched. Even the baskets woven from reed and wild grass hung empty, swaying slightly in the breeze that coasted through. Tools, like speech, had their moments. Silence had its own. He came to the first plot, a modest square where he had scattered incorn seed 10 nights before. Not a single green bruise broke the soil's skin. He neither frowned nor sighed. Instead, he crouched, gathering the same earth between thumb and forefinger, letting it crumble. It flaked into fragile shards, not yet given to moisture. The sky had withheld rain, though not cruelly, simply as a matter of mood. He considered the angle of the sun, the smell of air. He recognized that the clouds sailed high and loose, promising no afternoon downpour, yet he could hear, in the distance, the testimony of frogs beside the marsh, a low chorus forecasting eventual wetness. Perhaps tomorrow, or another dawn. He would wait for it. One could think of waiting as an absence, but the first farmer experienced it as a widening, an expansion of each sense until it enclosed everything between horizon and heartbeat. While he knelt, he noticed the tiny scaffolds of spider silk strung between clod and pebble, trembling in the faintest wind. He noticed a lone feather, white with ash-gray tip, fallen from the wing of an owl that must have hunted in the small hours. He noticed, too, the hush of seeds below, a stillness pregnant with mathematics he could feel but never solve. How starch would convert to sugar, how sugar would ignite into cells, how cells would ascend toward sun. All of that hidden now. Waiting, like him. He lingered by the silent patch until the sun at last lifted, a copper coin balanced on the lip of the world. Its light struck the ground at an oblique angle, stretching shadows of the unsprouted rows in delicate bars. He saw his own shape lean westward on the soil, thin and reed-like, waving slightly as he breathed. In that mirrored reed he read a sort of scripture, that a man standing still was not doing nothing. He was rooting. A breath later he moved to the next field, smaller still, a cradle of loose loam enriched last winter with charcoal and broken bone. Here, too, nothing yet stirred, but as his feet pressed gentle indentations into the dark bed, he remembered what lay beneath. Fava beans, thick and meaty, treasures from a trade journey 5 seasons back. He had planted them deeper than the grains, whispering into each shallow pocket of earth before covering it, a habit that felt both foolish and necessary. "Grow slow," he had whispered. "Teach me your pace." Now he repeated that whisper aloud, voice scarcely more than lip movement. The air accepted every syllable, folding them into its unnoticed currents. From beyond the fava, plot, a faint clatter of stones settled as a marmot scampered across the terrace wall. The farmer lifted his gaze, watched the small creature pause on a sun-warmed rock, nose twitching. It looked round as if to ask permission before diving into its burrow. He nodded in greeting. The marmot was a neighbor. Neighbors shared silence rather than gossip. They waited side by side for seasons to instruct them. He walked on, toes brushing dew-jeweled blades of wild grass that bordered his cultivated patches. That dew had not been heavy, only a delicate frosting, vanishing almost as his feet discovered it. The remnants dampened his sandals' leather straps, cooling skin. Each sensation was noted but not grasped, accepted but not hoarded. He sensed that the day would rise to warmth. The sky already hinted at a pale, even heat. Perhaps the barley in the upper plot would prefer warmth to dampness. Perhaps it would stir without any coaxing. And if not today, then tomorrow, or the next turning of the moon. Waiting gave the moon time to engrave its pale crescents into memory. He paused at the center of all his plots, where a solitary willow branch, stripped of bark, stood upright in the ground. It marked nothing, no boundary, no row, but served as a pointer to a thought long ago. He had thrust it there on an evening when the sunset bled lavender and rust, at a moment of sudden aching clarity. That even a man who owns nothing more than his breath may plant a marker for invisible things, hopes, questions, pauses. The branch had dried and cracked, but its presence still reminded him that ideas, like seeds, germinate under unseen horizons. And so he crouched beside that branch now, letting one hand rest upon its splintered surface. Though it was dead wood, he imagined sap once climbing inside, every fiber thrumming with green endeavor. He wondered what that climb had felt like, whether trees knew the patience of their own growing. His fingers drifted to the soil again, and an unexpected scent rose. not the expected aroma of bare dirt, but a subtle sweetness, perhaps wild thyme crushed underfoot. He inhaled, letting fragrance settle into his lungs like a soft herb smoke. Another lesson: even when nothing sprouts, a hidden bloom may breathe its scent upward. Birdsong at last stitched itself into the margins of air, a slow, measured trill from a greenfinch perched on a distant thorn. The farmer turned slightly, acknowledging it with a half-smile. The bird's rhythm matched the hush. Not a jubilant explosion, but a syllable spaced apart, dewdrop by dewdrop. Sound itself was learning to wait. Mid-morning spread amber over the valley. He relocated to the high bank where Alois soil crumbled under his sandals, and from there he surveyed the mosaic of browns, tans, and faint grays that composed his unfurling estate. It was modest, just enough to feed him and trade a little grain for salt and obsidian blades in the late summer market. Yet in that mosaic he saw an order as intricate as constellations. Each square of soil carried a story. Each story had chosen not to speak yet. That was acceptable. Stars waited entire eons to speak as light. He sat then, folding legs beneath him, elbows on knees, palms upturned, as though rain might pool there. Silence nested thickly around, but he noticed one sound crack the glaze. His own heartbeat, strong but unhurried, a drum that kept time with stones rather than hours. With heartbeat as metronome, he let memory drift in. There was the memory of first planting, when he had been young and restless, stabbing seed holes like a warrior, hoping soil could be conquered. He remembered the disappointment when many sprouts had withered, impatient roots exposed to too much sun. He had cursed then. Now he blessed that memory, because it taught him to be seed-brave but soil-gentle. Another memory floated in. An evening when he had raced clouds, trying to gather sheaves before rain ruined them. His haste had shattered stems. The elder who traded salt had laughed kindly. "Even the rush of feet will not outrun clouds, child." That laughter still rang in his ears, mellow as a reed flute. Memories arrived and left like herons gliding across a marsh, long-winged, graceful, bearing parts of himself he had nearly forgotten. And with each passage, the waiting opened wider, became roomier, as though silence stretched its walls to house recollection. In that stretch he found a quiet joy, the recognition that waiting was never truly empty. It brimmed with echoes, roots, even with those unborn shoots still curled beneath. The sun climbed, and with it came faint heat that shimmered over the stones lining his irrigation ditch. He rose, walked to the ditch's edge. Water trickled slowly, diverted from a creek that ran beyond the hill. The trickle was modest this year, the mountain snows reluctant to thaw. Yet the water spoke in tiny silver murmurs, a secret conversation with pebbles. He watched a brown leaf ride the current, weaving around grains of sand, spinning gently before disappearing into a culvert made of hollowed tamarisk trunk. The leaf's journey required no witness, but he witnessed it nonetheless, finding in its aimless dance another sermon of unhurried purpose. He traced the water's surface with a fingertip, then tasted the cool droplet caught at his nail. Mineral, earthy, reminding him of deep springs. Behind him, air shimmered with the wings of a dragonfly, its translucent membranes catching sunlight like stained glass. It hovered above his shoulder before darting away toward cattails. Even insects knew the lineage of patience. Their flights were swift, but born from days of stillness inside nymphal shells beneath mud. The farmer smiled, recognizing kinship in the balance between motion and pause. Farther along the ditch, he noted where reeds had begun to choke the flow. He considered cutting them. The bronze sickle would sever them easily. Yet he hesitated, remembering that Reeds anchored soil against sudden floods. He knelt, parted them gently with both hands, feeling the bend and flex of fibrous stems that had stood through storm and drought alike. Perhaps he would thin them later, perhaps not. Today, observation sufficed. Midday's white light approached. He returned to the main field and stood in its center like a compass needle, sensing the sky revolve. Heat pressed lightly upon his shoulders. A bead of sweat formed, rolled down the channel of his spine, cooled at his waist. He welcomed the sensation, proof that he, too, was a vessel of water, that evaporation would return part of him to the clouds. Around him, the land breathed heat in low ripples rising from the earth's skin. And just then, a subtle tremor teased the soil beneath his feet. No quake, merely the faintest settling of subterranean stones, or perhaps the echo of distant hoofbeats. He paused, focusing downward, letting the soles of his feet read the message. It passed, leaving only the original hush. Yet even that momentary rumor reminded him that waiting was never stagnant. It pulsed with innumerable, tiny inflections of change. A shadow slid over the field as a vulture sailed overhead. Its broad wings caught thermals, circling once, twice, before drifting east toward cliffs. Scavengers, too, had their watchful seasons. The farmer shaded his eyes, following the bird's trajectory until it vanished beyond an outcrop. He lowered his hand slowly, as though setting a ceremonial object upon an altar. Afternoon dulled into the golden hush of late sun. Passing clouds etched brief shapes upon the dust. Shapes that swam across his fields like gray fish leaving traceless wakes. He walked among them, letting each brief shadow wash over his bare forearms, anointing him with coolness. He imagined the seeds below feeling the same stroke of shade, a reprieve from glare. Even ungerminated kernels might welcome shade. And so the hours idled on, yet never idled in vain. For every breath he found a nuance, the flavor of sunlight shifting from citrus bright to honey warm, the vibration of cicada wings starting up, then ebbing, the faint crackle of a distant fire used by travelers on the old salt road, the resin scent that pine trunks released as the heat coaxed sap outward. Each note slipped into the great score of his waiting, a symphony slow enough for stars to join. Twilight arrived on gentle feet, the sky bruised purple at its edges, then deepened into lapis. Evening winds stirred, carrying dust-sweet aromas of crushed grass. The first farmer returned to his reed-woven mat outside the hut, and sat, legs crossed, as night's first cricket tuned its string. He watched shadows pour themselves into furrows until the rows vanished, leaving only the memory of geometry. Above, one star blinked awake, then another. He thought of the seeds again, tiny coffins holding dreams. But he did not mourn their dormancy. He trusted that mysteries nested inside husks, just as constellations nested within the sky's darker scrolls. Waiting was worship. Every minute knelt before the unseen. Night matured. A crescent moon slid into view, its horns pale and fine. He noted how moonlight touched the standing willow marker, edging it in silver. The branch seemed almost alive, as though the moon's glow rekindled sap in the dry wood. He felt his own breath slow to match that silent luminescence, the rise and fall of ribs echoing lunar pulse. At last, when the air cooled enough to raise small goosebumps along his arms, he lay back upon the mat. Belly to stars, he let the weight of body surrender to ground. The planet's slow heartbeat came up through reeds and cloth, and he exhaled, merging pulse with pulse. He did not close his eyes immediately. Instead, he watched a meteor scratch its white secret across the firmament, swift, bright, gone. It reminded him that even the most fleeting motion served the greater stillness. Eventually his lids drifted down, not in fatigue, but in gratitude. Sleep would take him soon. Yet, before it did, he whispered into the dark, not to summon dreams, but to honor the day's long vigil. Thank you for the waiting. The words dissipated like smoke, dissolving into the cricket's glide, into the owl's muted glide, into the silent work of seeds below. Somewhere beyond, the universe turned another imperceptible degree, measuring time by orbits rather than hours. And that turning is where we shall rest, dear listener, before the next dawn lifts us gently into Chapter 2. If these quiet moments settled your spirit, leave a tender word below, and, if you wish, press like and subscribe so our circle of calm may widen. Until the next morning's hush, may your heart wait softly, just as the first farmer does now. The morning came softly, as if apologizing for having taken the stars away. A breath of cool wind slipped across the reed mat where the first farmer lay, rustling the edge of his woven garment. His eyes opened not with alarm, but with the quiet awareness of a rhythm already in motion. He rose with the slowness of stones shifting under water, each movement a return to some remembered stillness. The sky above his hut had already begun its slow melting from deep blue to pale, and in the hush that hung between moments he felt the silence of soil still holding its secrets. He walked without shoes, letting the morning dew press up through his soles, each blade of grass a whisper, each pebble a note in the day's first hymn. The fields awaited him again, and though he had walked them 100 times before, today they held a different kind of stillness, not the waiting hush of becoming, but the heavy pause of things that had not begun at all. Nothing had broken the crust of soil where the seeds had been placed with such care. Nothing stirred beneath the faint crust of the earth. It was a silence different from sleep. It was the silence of something withheld. He came first to the wheat plot, the one he had marked with a simple cord of woven bark. It was the earliest planting, done just after the thaw, when the ground was pliable and eager to receive. He had pressed each grain into its shallow bed, covered them with dust and breath, and whispered blessings passed down by his father, low, murmuring things shaped by years of faith. But now, weeks later, the soil looked no different than the day he pressed the seeds into it. No green tips, no shifting texture, not even the faintest splitting of dirt where a stem might hope to rise. He knelt. His fingers brushed the surface, lifting a thin layer of earth. He brought it to his nose. It smelled dry in a way that suggested not punishment, but a withholding, like a mouth choosing not to speak. The soil was not angry, it was simply not ready. He did not sigh, there was no place for sighs here. Instead, he lowered his hand back to the ground, flattened his palm, and rested it there. He let his body weight settle into that one connection, the full weight of his breath pressing into the soil's shallow skin. In the stillness, the quiet hum of the earth beneath him seemed to rise, distant, subtle, almost imagined, but he felt it. Not life, not yet. Just the vibration of something old, still listening. Moving slowly, he walked the perimeter of the patch. Small stones lined the edges, collected from the river months ago, placed there one by one. He ran his hand along them now, feeling how the cool of night still clung to their flanks. Each stone held its own age, its own silence. They had seen seeds fail before. They had witnessed the years when nothing grew, and the years when too much did. They asked nothing of him. They only offered presence. That, he had learned, was sometimes enough. He sat then on one of the larger stones, legs folded beneath him, arms loose on his knees. Across the bare field, dust drifted gently with the breeze, rising in tiny curls where sun met shade. He watched as two birds, a blackbird and a lark, flitted across the sky in soft loops. Their wings carved patterns in air, brief and beautiful. They had no interest in the silent earth below. And yet, watching them, he felt no envy. They did not plant. They did not wait in the same way. But their flight was a part of the rhythm all the same. Everything waited for something. He remembered then a time, many seasons ago, when his hands had been less patient. He had planted and then scraped back the soil each day to check. He had doubted the seed. He had distrusted the soil. And in his hurrying, he had broken the fragile green necks of the shoots that had dared to rise. That season taught him what silence required. Not inspection, not anxiety, just space. A sudden gust lifted a swirl of dried leaves from the path behind him, and with them came the scent of old ash, perhaps from the fire pit he had cleaned days before. It clung to the air for a breath, then faded. Ash was like memory. It lingered without clinging. It reminded without insisting. He rose from the stone, brushed the dust from his knees, and moved on. He walked next to the millet plot, where nothing but the prints of insects stitched tiny trails across the surface. Even the ants moved slowly today, as if they too sensed the waiting. The plot had been turned more shallowly than the wheat, millet needing less, but even so, not a single sprout had dared to lift. He touched the soil, warmer here, drier. He closed his eyes, imagined the seed cases still sleeping. They did not fear the light. They simply were not ready to meet it. A few paces to the west, where he had once cleared stones from the path, he now saw small green shoots. Wild things, not his. Perhaps goat's beard, perhaps sorrel. He crouched beside them. These had not waited. They had not needed blessing or tending. They had come of their own. Their slender forms reached upward without shame, and he let himself feel the quiet ache of that. The truth that not everything in the field was his. Not every green thing bowed to planting. Some came unbidden, and that too was the field's way of speaking. He gathered a single sorrel leaf, crushed it lightly between thumb and forefinger, then tasted the edge, sharp, clean. It cut across his tongue like a memory, waking his senses. Bitterness has its place in waiting. Not everything must be sweet to be true. Overhead, the sun drifted higher, shedding its softness. The air grew golden, warmer now. From the far edge of the valley came the faint bark of a fox or jackal, thin and echoing. Life stirred beyond the silence of his rows, and still the field held its quiet refusal. He made no judgment. He only walked, tracing his steps along the outer path that encircled all his plots. He remembered the day he carved that path with a digging stick and an aching back. The sun had been relentless. The soil had been stubborn, and yet inch by inch he had shaped the circle, an old tradition passed down from his grandmother's people, who had said a circular path helped the field remember the seasons, helped it feel held. As he walked that circle now, he hummed. Not a song exactly, just a line of sound, one note into another. Like stones clicking gently in a stream. The field would recognize it. He had hummed it during planting. He would hum it again during harvest, if harvest came. And if it did not come, if the field remained bare, he would still hum. The song was not a reward. It was a way of keeping time. Pausing beside the flax patch, he looked down at the earth with a strange affection. Flax had never been eager here. It needed more water, more attention. He had planted it anyway, not for the oil, not even for the thread, but because he liked its blue blossoms. Last season, it had bloomed early, startled by a sudden rain. This season, not a whisper of blue, just dirt, still and undecided. He bent low, ran his hands gently across the top of the soil, brushing aside small pebbles. His fingers felt the resistance of clay deeper down. He nodded. The field was thinking, and thinking took time. He remained there a while, crouched and still, letting his thoughts settle into the quiet. No plans, no corrections, just presence. A breeze passed, lifting a lock of hair from his brow. He did not move it back. Let the wind have its moment. Behind him, a bird chirped once, then twice. He turned his head, saw a finch hopping near the edge of the flax rows, pecking lightly at a piece of husk. He watched as the bird tilted its head, then took flight. It left no message, no omen, just movement. That too was enough. He stood again, brushing dust from his palms, and looked across all that had not grown. It did not feel like loss, it felt like listening, like the long, slow inhale before a story begins. He would come back tomorrow, and the day after, whether anything rose or not. That was his rhythm now. Not to wait for a thing, but to wait with it. The seeds, the field, the silence, and somewhere beneath the skin of soil, a root perhaps stirred, not to rise, not yet, but to reach sideways into the dark, remembering the shape of thirst. The first farmer turned, walking back toward the shelter as the sun climbed. The earth behind him said nothing, but he knew better than to call it empty. He would wait again tomorrow, in the same way, with the same quiet breath, with the same open hands. And tomorrow, perhaps, the silence would have shifted, even slightly, but for now it was enough to know it had been held. It was still early when the first farmer stepped out again, the breath of night not yet fully gone from the valley's folds. The air, though touched by a hint of warmth, carried the last of the dew's cool perfume, and the ground beneath his feet held the hush of things not yet stirred. A crow called once, then fell silent. Even the birds, it seemed, understood the weight of this hour, the in-between, not morning, not night. A pause before sound, a breath before movement. The first farmer stood in that breath, listening. He did not go first to the center of the field, nor to the water ditch, nor to the plots where sprouts had still not broken. He walked to the edge of the eastern rows, where the old acacia tree leaned over a patch of soil that remained forever half in shadow. Here, beside the seedbed, lay a long sweep of darkness, soft-edged, not cold, not ominous, but persistent. It had always been there, since long before his first planting. Some days it was longer, other days shorter, but it never fully left. The sun's arc bent too far south in the cold months, and too high in the warm ones to light it completely. The first farmer had once considered cutting the acacia back, letting the sun touch every inch of his field evenly. But he never did, and now the shadow had become something more than a patch of absence. It was a companion to the seed, just as water was, just as time was. He crouched beside the shaded soil and pressed his fingers into its skin. Cooler here, still damp even though the rest of the field had begun to dry. The texture was different too, richer, he thought, like the way night feels deeper than day. The seeds in this shadowed soil would grow slowly. That he knew. But sometimes the slow things lasted longer. The things that waited for the full call of the sun before they dared emerge. He traced a shallow groove beside one of the rows with his fingertip and watched a small beetle emerge from beneath a clump of earth, its back glinting faintly where light met a shell. Even the insects had their shadowed trails, their soft, unhurried crossings. He remembered how the elders had once told him that every growing thing needs a little darkness. Roots reached toward it. Shoots passed through it on their way to the air. And people, too, had their shaded places. The quiet parts not meant for full sun. He let that thought rest in him like a stone, warmed by breath. Some days he had words for these reflections. Today he had only the quiet, and it was enough. As the sun climbed higher, Its light struck the upper branches of the acacia and sent thin rays flickering down through the leaves. The shadow on the ground danced, but did not vanish. The first farmer watched the flickers move like water across the earth, illuminating, then softening, then vanishing altogether. He stood slowly, keeping his eyes on the point where light and shade touched, never quite blending. It reminded him of a line drawn not with ink but with breath, always shifting, never fixed. He walked the edge of the shaded plot, his feet brushing against the tender fuzz of volunteer grasses. Some were bending toward the sun, their leaves turned outward in longing. Others had remained low and folded, content to grow beneath the sky's dimmer portions. He admired both, the bold and the quiet, the visible and the hidden. They belonged to the same green story, even if they read different pages. A breeze came, not strong, but steady, carrying with it the scent of sap, warm bark, and dust lifted from far-off paths. It tugged at the edges of his tunic, rattled the high dry pods in the acacia, and passed over the fields without needing to stop. As it brushed his face, the first farmer closed his eyes. He imagined the wind tracing the same lines it always had, over the hills, across the stones, down into the low places where water collected and frogs hummed their deep, muddy songs. The wind knew all the places he did not, and still, it chose to return here, to pass through this place where seeds waited beneath shadows. He opened his eyes again and walked further down the shaded side of the field. A thin vine curled up a bare stick he had once planted to mark the corner boundary. He had forgotten about it. Now, the vine had nearly overtaken it, wrapping around like a question, twisting its way up a remembered thought. The vine's leaves were pale, almost yellow. Not enough sun, but still, it climbed. Slowly, deliberately, as if to say, shadow slows me, but it does not stop me. He crouched beside it and cupped the base of the vine in his hands. It was fragile, this small climber, but it held tight to the stick. He could feel its determination in the tension of its tendrils. Not fierce, just certain. That, too, was part of the waiting. Not waiting in stillness, but waiting in motion that no one noticed. From here, he could see the sunlit portion of the field just beyond the shadow line. The contrast was sharp now. There, the soil baked gently under the morning heat. There, the ants bustled. There, even the air shimmered slightly. But where he knelt, the coolness held. The sound of his breath felt louder here, more rounded. The stillness folded around him like the inside of a shell. He remembered planting in this shadowed part late in the day, when the light had already begun to slip down behind the western ridge. He had pressed the seeds in with care, as always, but something had stayed his hand. Not reluctance, not doubt, just a sense that this corner would grow differently. And so, he had not marked it with the same carved stone. He had not whispered the same blessings. He had simply planted, and stepped back, and waited. Now, standing once more, he saw that no green had risen from that shadowed soil, but the absence no longer felt like failure. It felt like pause, like the held breath before a word is spoken, like the moment just before music begins, not silence, but the shape of the first note. He traced the edge of the shadow with his toe, slowly dragging a line in the soil that curved along the light. As he moved, his foot struck something solid. He bent to look. A smooth piece of obsidian, perhaps dropped from his own pouch months ago. He picked it up, felt its coolness against his palm, and turned it in the light. Even in the shade, it caught gleams. Obsidian always remembered fire. He tucked it back into his pouch and looked at the earth again. The soil in the shaded patch seemed to thicken as the day lengthened, taking on a heavier texture. Where sun had dried the rest of the field, this part stayed supple. It held water better. It yielded more slowly to foot and hand. He placed a flat palm on the ground and closed his eyes again, letting his skin speak to the soil. It gave no reply, but something in the quiet pulse of it told him the roots were listening. He rose, dusted his hands, and walked the length of the shadow again. This time, he did not look down. He looked at the shadow itself, not as absence, but as presence, as a being, a teacher, a cover. Not everything needed to bloom at once. Not everything needed to grow in light. The first farmer walked on, moving toward the plots that shimmered under the full heat of the day, but he carried the shadow with him, not as weight, but as reminder, that every field had a hidden part, that every life had corners the sun would not reach, and that even there the seed waited. The sky above him shone without blemish, the kind of unbroken blue that offered no hint of storm or shade. But below, on the earth, the shadows still moved, quietly, gently, like a thought that had not yet found its words. He walked the rest of the field slowly, feeling the breeze return in soft gusts, stirring the tops of the taller grasses, curling through the empty baskets that hung from the shelter posts. The earth smelled of heat now, not dust, and somewhere, not far, a lizard scurried between stones, its body catching flashes of gold. When he returned to the edge of the shaded plot, he paused. The line between light and dark had shifted slightly. Not much, just a few inches, but enough. He stepped into the shadow once more and stood still. The sun would eventually reach this place. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but the line would move. And when it did, the seeds would feel it, and they would decide what to do. Until then, he would not force their blooming. He would not dig them up or urge them on. He would wait, as he always did, not outside the shadow, but beside it. For the seed, too, has its own wisdom. It knows when to wake, and it knows when to dream a little longer. And so, beneath the shifting canopy of that ancient tree, with sun and silence leaning equally across the earth, the first farmer stood with the waiting, letting the shade tell its story, letting the seeds sleep a while more. The morning passed slowly, as it always did. The sun stretched higher over the far ridge, leaning down with a warmth that shimmered softly across the terraces. In the upper field, the first farmer moved with measured steps, his shadow long and curved ahead of him, spilling over the furrowed earth like water. He did not carry a tool, only his thoughts and the weight of another quiet day. He walked until he reached the edge of the barley rows, where the fields began to soften into scrub, and there, not far from the old wild fig, sat the stone. It was older than the field, older than his hands, older, perhaps, than the farming itself. Rounded at the edges and half buried in earth, the stone had been there since before he ever pressed seed to soil, before the first boundary line was drawn, before the first basket of grain was measured by palm and eye. It sat low and wide, like a silent elder keeping watch. And this morning, like so many others, the first farmer made his way to it, not to change anything, not to speak, not to fix, but simply to sit beside it. He lowered himself slowly onto its sun-warmed surface, feeling the heat seep up through the cloth wrapped around his legs. The stone never hurried. It never asked anything. But it was always there, steady, immovable, patient in a way that even the earth admired. Some mornings, he sat here for the length of a shadow's crawl. Other mornings, only long enough to let his breath find its rhythm. Today, he did not know how long he would stay, but he did know that the stone would not mind. From this place, the fields spread out below him like a sleeping quilt, stitched in greens and browns and soft silvers of mist still caught in the low channels. He could trace each path with his eyes, each row, each contour of soil where his hands had shaped and reshaped the land over the years, the harvests that came, the seasons that didn't, the patches where nothing had ever grown, the places where things had bloomed without his asking. All of it held in the view below, quiet and still under the morning sky. He looked, but he did not search. This was not a moment for questions. It was a moment for resting beside something older than answers. He reached down and ran his palm along the rough surface of the stone, letting his fingers settle into the grooves worn by time, weather, and the weight of waiting. Lichen had begun to bloom on one side, soft, greenish-gray, like a whisper of moss. He pressed his thumb into it gently, not to test it, but simply to feel what had grown where nothing else had ever tried. Lichen did not ask for water. It did not reach toward sun. It merely existed in stillness, holding fast to what others overlooked. He wondered if the seeds in his shaded field felt like this, waiting without expectation, surviving in the silence. He thought of the first time he noticed this stone. He had been a boy then, no more than shoulder-high to a reed stalk. His mother had sent him out to gather kindling, and his eyes had caught the shape half hidden in the tall grass. At first, he had imagined it was a sleeping animal, curled tight against the earth. But as he approached, the shape held, unmoving. Calm, a stone, yes, but something about it had felt aware, even then. He had reached out with a child's curiosity and touched it, and in that moment something settled in him, not wonder, not fear, just stillness, a sense that something was listening beneath the soil. He remembered returning to it later, in the years that followed. When the rains came too late, when the frost came too soon, when he buried his father under the tamarisk tree with only one song on his lips, when he waited for the first stalks of emmer to rise after a long, bitter drought. The stone had been there through all of it. Never moved, never cracked, never turned away, even the storms had rolled past without shifting it. And in that unmoving shape, he had found a kind of faith that no prayer could teach. The wind passed over now, stirring his tunic and rustling the dried grass around the base of the stone. The farmer closed his eyes and let the sound wrap around him. The world beyond this place continued, as it always did, creatures hunting and hiding, birds nesting, distant fires being lit in other valleys. But here, beside the stone, everything narrowed to breath and breeze, and the faint pulse of something ancient beneath the soles of his feet. He opened his eyes again and leaned back, letting his weight press fully into the stone's body. It held him without effort. As it always did, he tilted his head to the sky, watching the soft drift of clouds move across the pale blue. A hawk circled high, casting its fleeting shadow below. He followed its path until it vanished over the ridge. Somewhere below, the field waited still. No sprouts had emerged. The seeds remained silent, but the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt full, like the pause between drumbeats, like the moment before a name is spoken. The sun had risen higher now, and the heat deepened against his skin. He ran his hand again along the stone's edge, slower this time, feeling how the surface curved, how time had smoothed it, how even the roughest parts had softened. He wondered how long the stone had waited before anything grew near it, how many rains it had endured, how many footsteps it had felt and forgotten. He had once asked himself whether the stone was part of the land or a visitor from elsewhere, but over the years he had stopped asking. The stone belonged simply because it stayed. A bee buzzed past his ear, paused near his shoulder, then wandered on toward a patch of wildflowers that had taken root at the edge of the scrub. The flowers had not been planted. They had not been planned. Yet here they were, blooming with color, bold in the sun. He turned his head to look at them, small and yellow, petals splayed open like tiny suns. He smiled softly. Even beauty waited in its own way. Even color could come without a reason. The wind shifted again, cooler now. A sign that afternoon had begun its slow descent. The shadows shortened, then started to stretch again in the other direction. He rose from the stone slowly, carefully, and placed his palm flat against its side once more. A gesture not of farewell, but of recognition. He did not speak. The stone would not have answered anyway, but the gesture mattered. He turned then and walked down the slope toward the lower field, each step soft in the dusty soil. The barley rows shimmered faintly in the heat, and the path curved beside them like a memory returning. He did not rush. He walked with the same pace he always did, step after step, as if the rhythm itself was enough. And behind him the stone waited, as it always had, as it always would, not counting time, not holding it, just being part of it. And ahead, somewhere between the dust and the light, the seeds still slept. Not in silence, but in the presence of something older than bloom. Something shaped like patience, something shaped like stone. The wind came before the sun that morning, brushing over the field in long, low sighs that lifted dust from the rows and carried it into the silver haze of the waking sky. The first farmer stirred at the sound of it, not startled, but drawn gently from sleep like a leaf turning over in its sleep on still water. He rose slowly from his mat, his body stiff from the coolness of the night, his bones creaking like old wood, but his breath steady, full. Before light had spilled over the eastern ridge, he was already walking. He moved across the narrow trail that led from the shelter, past the old tamarisk with its low, shaggy branches, and onto the wide-open field that waited like a held breath. The soil had been turned weeks ago, each row etched with care, straight, smooth, steady. They stretched from one end of the field to the other like lines in an old song he had learned by feel rather than memory. No green yet broke their surface. Not even the tiniest flicker of life stirred between them. Only the wind passed over, whispering low, curling in little spirals between the furrows, lifting bits of husk and grain chaff, spinning them into air before letting them fall again. He stood at the edge of the field, watching how the wind touched everything but left nothing changed. A rhythm without footprint, a visitor without form. It moved like memory, always returning, never explaining. He stepped forward, feeling the breeze slide along his arms, into the folds of his tunic, across the bare skin of his neck. It was neither warm nor cold, it simply was, the way silence is, the way time is. He felt his heartbeat settle into its slow cadence, one that matched the breathing of the world. He walked along the first row. His sandals brushed against the soft mounds of turned soil, dislodging nothing, only nudging dust into the air with each careful step. The soil felt different today, lighter somehow. Not dry exactly, but hollow, as though the wind had taken something from it, or left something behind. He knelt and ran his fingers along the edge of the furrow. Grains of earth slipped between his fingertips like flour. He brought a pinch to his nose and inhaled. It smelled of stone and distance, of things carried too far. The wind had come from somewhere else today. He could feel it in the taste of the dust. He looked up, eyes tracing the horizon. The field rolled outward in gentle undulations, and beyond it the hills were blue and soft and barely visible. The sky above was pale, streaked with thin bands of white, clouds not dense enough to rain, only drifting, like skin on old milk. Birds flew low, their wings adjusting to the changing air. A heron lifted from the marsh beyond the reeds and glided across the far edge of the field, its long neck outstretched, its wings slow and deliberate. The rows waited still. Each line of soil curved gently toward the hill's slope. They had been formed with care, with patience, each one smoothed by hand, spaced by rhythm. Not precision. Rhythm. He had dug them in silence, listening to the scrape of the wooden tool in the earth, feeling the pull in his shoulders, the bend in his spine. He remembered how the air had smelled then, wet, heavy with the promise of rain that never came. Since then, the days had passed without sprout, without green, without sign. And still, each morning, he returned. He bent low again, placing one ear close to the soil. There was no sound, not even the faint tremble of roots moving. Just wind, wind passing overhead, brushing the reeds along the irrigation path, rattling the dry seed husks still hanging from the wild grass. He closed his eyes. He imagined the wind moving through the valley, past the cliffs where goats balanced on narrow ledges, past the trees whose leaves curled inward at dusk, past the caves where old bones slept beneath centuries of dust. All of it breathed. All of it waited. He remembered the elders once saying that bare rows are not empty, they are listening. Listening to what the world has not said yet. Listening to what the rain still holds in its throat. Listening for the footfall of birds, the whisper of roots. The wind, too, was part of that waiting. Not as answer, but as reminder. He stood again and walked further into the field. The rows became less sharp as he moved westward, the soil less smooth. Here, the ground had resisted his hand. Stones clustered beneath the surface, roots of old weeds curled like sleeping fingers. He had not cleared this section as carefully, not for lack of effort, but because the soil seemed to ask him to wait longer. And so, he had. Planting there had felt different, less certain, more like a question he didn't yet know how to ask. He stepped into the space between two of the rows and stood still, letting the wind pass over his shoulders. He spread his arms slightly, palms open, and turned his face to the breeze. The scent had shifted. Less of dust now, more of water, a hint of coolness that came from nowhere he could see. He breathed it in slowly, held it, let it settle in the hollow of his chest. Sometimes the wind lied. Sometimes it carried the smell of rain that never came. But even lies could be part of the rhythm. He moved again, slow, tracing the edges of the field with his eyes and feet. Each pass was a circle, loose and widening, like a bird circling a pond before landing. He did not look for signs anymore. He simply was among the rows, a man among lines, a breath among whispers. The wind rustled his hair. It stirred the dry reeds beside the ditch. It played at the edge of the stone circle where he often knelt at dusk. It ran its fingers along the edge of his shelter. All of it part of the same movement. Once, in a season of drought, he had dug deep into the soil, searching for the lost pulse of moisture. His hands had bled, his fingers cracked, and the earth had given him nothing. That year he had feared he had forgotten how to wait. But the stone, the wind, the bare rows, they had reminded him. Waiting was not absence. It was presence stretched thin. It was breath held long. It was touch without grasping. He knelt again at the base of the furrow nearest the tamarisk, the wind now steady against his back. He placed both hands into the soil, not digging, not probing, just pressing, feeling the shape of the ground as it was, cool beneath the crust. Quiet. He imagined the seed resting there, not sleeping, listening. And he wondered if it felt the wind above it. If it dreamed of air. If it turned slightly in its husk, sensing motion it did not yet understand. The clouds thickened slightly, casting a gentle gray across the field. The light changed. Shadows softened. The wind bent low, whispering now. The first farmer sat in the middle of the rows and let the silence take shape around him. The kind of silence that holds the stories of things not yet spoken. He let his spine curl, his shoulders loosen. His breath matched the sway of the grass. And for a moment in that hush, he felt the rows shift. Not with growth, not with sound, but with knowing. The wind passed over again. The field remained bare, but it no longer felt still. It felt like a voice being drawn in, like a body preparing to rise. Not today, not yet, but soon. He stood, dust clinging to his knees, and walked once more along the rows, tracing them with his steps. The wind moved with him, over him, through him, like an old companion with no name. And behind him, the rows remained bare, soft underfoot, and full of waiting. He would return tomorrow, and the day after that, and each time the wind would meet him, and each time the rows would hold their breath, and each time he would listen. It rained in the night, but not here. The first farmer knew it before he even rose from his mat. He had dreamt of the sound, distant and full, the kind of dream that leaves behind a scent in the mind. When he stepped into the early light, his bare feet met dust, not mud. The air smelled faintly of wetness, but the earth beneath his hut remained untouched, dry, firm, unchanged. He looked to the sky, saw the lingering streaks of morning cloud trailing away to the west, and felt the thin ache of something that passed him by without meaning to, not in anger, not in oversight, just in the way of weather, just in the way of life. He walked toward the field with steady steps, his hands folded lightly behind his back. The world around him had the hush of something recently stirred. The leaves on the tamarisk had darkened, not from water, but from the night's breath. Birds moved in their usual patterns, a little lower, a little slower, feathers unruffled. The wind was gone for now, having spent itself in the places beyond the hills. Only the faintest scent of wet clay drifted through the valley. He followed it like a thread, curious but not expectant. When he reached the field's edge, he saw it, lines of wet soil where the sky had touched down for a moment, and then lines beside them, perfectly dry. The border was strange and uneven, as if the rain had paused mid-step, unsure of its reach. One half of the grain rows shimmered with moisture, dark and rich, the soil breathing upward with quiet thanks. The other half remained unchanged, light-colored and brittle, whispering softly beneath his feet like old parchment. He crouched and touched both with alternating hands, coolness on one palm, dryness on the other. A story in contrast. The seeds beneath the wet side would feel the weight, the softness, the invitation. The others would not. The same sun would rise above them both, and yet one would begin the long swell toward the surface while the other waited still. He stood, looking out over the uneven field. This was how it had always been, in some way or another. Nothing ever came evenly. Not the rains, not the blessings, not the moments that mattered. He remembered a season, many years ago, when the rain had come in one great curtain and flooded half the fields. The grain had grown tall and golden in the low places, while the high ground remained thin and short. It had been the first time he learned to harvest unevenly, to reap what was ready and leave what was not, trusting that the earth had its own calendar that did not match the skies. As he walked between the rows now, he saw the sheen of water held in the low furrows on one side, tiny reflections of the pale morning light. On the other side, fine dust lifted with each step, curling gently and then falling, settling again. The seeds would know the difference. He did not need to tell them which had been touched. They would rise, or not, when they were ready. He crouched again near the meeting line, where the dampness ended and the dryness resumed. He reached into the soil with both hands, one on either side, holding each in his palms, weighing them. They were the same, and not the same. The wet soil clung, shaped itself around his fingers. The dry slipped away, resistant to form. He did not judge either. There was no fault here, only difference. A small snail had crept across the damp side, its trail gleaming in a curve that caught the light. It had left no mark on the dry. He watched it for a long moment before lifting it gently and placing it in the shade of a low stone, where moisture still held. A gift, perhaps. A kindness that wouldn't change the field, but might change the snail's day. As he moved further through the rows, his feet learned the rhythm of the land beneath them. 3 steps soft, 2 steps dry. A strange music, like a song sung by 2 voices not quite in harmony but still beautiful. He let that rhythm enter him, let it change his breathing, his pace. He stopped looking for pattern and began simply moving, trusting the land to carry him where it wanted him to go. In the center of the field, where an old boundary marker still stood, a flat stone shaped like a sleeping bird, he paused. This place had once been a dividing line between his planting and his father's. Now it marked nothing, only memory. He brushed his hand over the top, feeling the warmth of stone where the sun had begun to lay its fingers. A thin line of water had collected at its base, a shallow crescent of rain's edge. The boundary had caught what the rest of the field had missed. He thought then of the sky, how it gives and withholds without map or reason, how it nourishes one leaf and not another, how it passes over even the faithful, even the careful, even the kind. The rain was not cruel, it was not kind, it was only rain, and the earth received it however it could. He walked on, listening to the hush of the day, the soft rustle of leaves, the dry click of seeds shifting inside their shells. On the side that had not been watered, a line of ants marched, carrying grains of soil, bits of husk. On the side that had, birds had begun to peck gently at the softened ground. Life knew where the water had gone, and it responded. At the far edge of the field, where the land sloped gently toward the streambed, he knelt again. Here the rain had touched only the edges, a soft sweep across the topsoil, not enough to sink deep, but enough to darken the surface. He pressed his hand flat against it, and the earth gave slightly, not yielding, but not resisting either. He imagined the roots below shifting slightly, sensing the presence above. The promise of moisture, the invitation to stretch. He remained there for some time, letting the silence settle over him. The kind of silence that feels full, the kind that holds more than words ever could. A breeze rose again, gentle and warm, as if the land were exhaling, as if it had waited for him to notice what the rain did not reach. And when he finally stood and looked out across the field one last time before returning to the shelter, he no longer saw absence. He saw 2 kinds of waiting, one soaked, one dry, one stirred, one still. And he knew both were part of the same field, the same story, the same slow turning breath of the world. He would return again the next day and the next. He would walk the lines, touch the soil, listen to the silence. And when the rain came again, whether tomorrow or not for many days, he would not beg it. He would not scold it. He would meet it however it arrived. And if it never came, he would still stay. Because what the rain did not reach still mattered, still waited, still belonged. The morning light crept over the hills with a soft, golden slowness, and the first farmer rose into it like something growing out of the ground. His movements were unhurried, shaped by sleep, shaped by memory. The wind had not returned since the last rain that touched only part of the field, and the air now held a stillness that pressed against the ears, like silence wrapped in wool. He gathered no tools, no baskets, not even water. only his hands and his steps. He did not need anything more. Not today, because today he would visit the tree. It stood alone at the northern edge of the field, on slightly higher ground where the soil grew thin and scattered stones broke the surface like old bones rising to meet the sun. The tree had always been there, long before the first furrow, long before the first seed. It had watched the seasons unfold like a book with no end, and had shaded his grandfather as surely as it now shaded him. He did not know its true name, though he had called it many things in his quiet hours. Windsleeper, dusk watcher, rooted, friend. But none of the names had ever answered back. He reached it just as the shadow of its branches stretched across the loose gravel at its feet. The bark was pale and grooved, a skin of long-etched years, and the limbs curved low enough that he could touch them without reaching. He placed a hand against the trunk. It was warm, dry, rough, familiar. He let his fingers rest there, waiting for something he could never quite explain. Years ago, when he was still learning the rhythm of the land, the tree had felt alive in a different way. Not just in the way all trees are alive, but in a way that breathed back. When he had rested beneath it in the midday heat, he had sometimes felt a hum through his spine, a pulsing that matched the rhythm of his thoughts. He had spoken aloud to it, nonsense or prayer or memory, and the tree had answered in the creak of its limbs or the rustle of leaves. It had not spoken in words, but it had spoken. Today, it did not. The branches held still. The leaves, though touched by the breeze of his passing, remained quiet. Not even a single fallen twig broke the dust beneath its canopy. The silence of the tree was not cold, but it was deep. He stepped around the base slowly, eyes tracing the folds and fissures of the bark, remembering where he had once found a lizard sleeping, where he had tied a string around the branch as a boy and pretended it was a signal flag for passing spirits. That string was long gone, worn away by rain and sun, but he remembered it. He knelt beside one of the roots that broke from the base and wound out into the dry ground like a sleeping animal. His hand brushed against it. Cool, even in the rising sun. He rested there for a while, back against the trunk, arms resting on his knees. And he listened. Not for sounds, for presence, for something beyond noise. But the tree did not stir. In the stillness, his thoughts began to wander. Not quickly, not in spirals, but in slow curves, like clouds turning over in the high air. He thought of the seasons when the tree had offered shelter. The heavy summer when his father died, and he'd sat beneath these very branches, the sun blistering the world, while the shade clung to him like an old blanket. The cold spring when the rains refused to fall, and he'd leaned his forehead against the bark, asking why the sky had forgotten them. And the day the grain burst into sudden gold without warning, when he had danced beneath these limbs with arms raised, whispering thanks to the roots. The tree had always been a companion. Even when it did not answer, it had been there. But this silence, it was different. He stood and placed both hands on the trunk, leaning his weight into it gently. "Are you sleeping?" he whispered, his voice barely a breeze. "Or am I no longer listening the right way?" His words hung in the air like smoke and vanished. He stepped back and looked upward, through the branches toward the pale blue of the sky. The tree's shape was unchanged. The same knots, the same heavy forks where birds sometimes nested. Nothing had left. Nothing had come. Still, something felt missing. Not in the tree, but in him. Maybe the silence wasn't the trees at all. Maybe it had been speaking in ways he had forgotten to hear. Maybe the language had changed, or maybe his heart had grown too full of waiting. Not the waiting of soil and rain, but the kind that sits in the chest like a still pond, unmoving and undisturbed. He lowered his gaze, returning to the roots, and for the first time noticed a small sprout pushing its way up near the base, pale green, thin, barely visible. He bent low, touched it lightly. It wasn't from the tree, not its offspring. A weed, perhaps, or a gift from a passing bird. But it grew in the shelter of the great limbs, hidden in the quiet. It had chosen that place, that silence, that shade. He sat again, folding his legs beneath him. The sun climbed, the light shifted. The field beyond shimmered faintly, and still the tree said nothing. But in that nothing he began to feel something else. Something rounder, older, a kind of fullness. The silence of the tree was not absence, it was depth. Like the quiet inside a seed before it splits. Like the hush before the first cry of a newborn. Not emptiness, not withholding, just waiting, just being. He closed his eyes, let his breath slow. The earth beneath him, the bark at his back, the shade wrapping around his shoulders like dusk arriving early. The silence deepened. It did not reach toward him, but it did not turn away either. It simply existed, holding him, holding itself. When he opened his eyes again, the light had shifted. Afternoon leaned against the hills now. The warmth had faded slightly. A bird landed on a low branch above him, then flew off again. The leaves moved gently in its passing, and then stilled once more. He stood slowly, brushing dust from his tunic. One hand pressed against the trunk one last time. He said nothing, and this time he did not expect a reply. He turned from the tree and walked back toward the field, his footsteps soft against the gravel path. Behind him, the limbs held still, the silence resting in their shade. Not all things speak when we ask them to. Some only speak when we're no longer listening. And some, like this tree, speak simply by staying. The sun fell early that day, not suddenly, but with a softness that seemed to ask for less movement, less thought, less of everything but stillness. The first farmer had watched it slip behind the western ridge with the slow dignity of something ancient and tired. He had risen early, walked the rows, checked the dry furrows where the rain had not reached, and sat with the tree that never spoke. But he had not worked the eastern plot, not yet. Not because he had forgotten, and not because he was waiting for more favorable skies. The tools were ready. His body was willing. The soil had been prepared. But something in the light told him to pause, to wait. Now the last threads of dusk had faded, and the moon rose alone over the hills, pale and deliberate. The first farmer stood barefoot at the edge of the unturned plot, his shadow stretching long behind him, a thin silhouette across the dry grass. The field here had not known the touch of the digging stick. No lines carved through it, no seeds pressed into its skin. It remained as it had through the long season, flat, untouched, woven with wild grass and the brittle remnants of old growth. He had meant to come, many times. Each morning he had said, "Today I will turn the eastern plot." But when the sun had risen, he had walked elsewhere. And now, under moonlight, the field looked back at him, silver-skinned and quiet, as though it too had expected this to happen sooner, and yet had grown comfortable with its own waiting. He stepped into the edge of it, the grass brushing his ankles like old fingers remembering a name. The soil beneath was dry, but not hard. It gave slightly under his weight. A forgiving ground, a listening ground. He did not bring the digging stick with him tonight. It rested still against the wall of the shelter, its handle smoothed by years of use, its blade darkened with time and oil. He could have carried it. But tonight was not for work. It was for something else. He wasn't sure what, only that the moon had risen with enough quiet to invite him here, not as a farmer, but as someone who had forgotten how to touch the earth without changing it. The stars followed the moon, one by one, without hurry, as if responding to the same rhythm. He looked up and saw their quiet forming above him, scattered like seeds across a black field, waiting for some ancient harvest he could not name. The air smelled of dry grass and old water, faint hints of last year's storms lingering in the stones. He breathed deeply, letting the scent fill his chest. It reminded him of times before he was a farmer, when the land had simply been land, when he had run across it with bare feet and open hands, not planting, not tending, just running. He walked further into the unturned field, and the moonlight followed, spilling across his shoulders and pooling at his feet. Each step stirred a faint sound, crushed stalks, loosened soil, the soft sigh of seeds not yet chosen. He stopped in the center where the earth dipped slightly, forming a shallow bowl. This was where he would have begun, had he dug today. He had seen it in his mind. The first line arcing from this hollow, like the opening line of a song. But now, standing in it under the silver gaze of the moon, the urge to break the soil vanished. This place did not need carving. Not yet, maybe not at all. He lowered himself slowly, folding into a crouch, hands resting on his knees. His eyes adjusted more fully to the dark, shapes sharpening into shadows and shades. The grasses moved gently in the breeze, not bowing, but swaying like breath. Somewhere nearby, an owl called, low and even, a sound too round to be sadness, too soft to be joy. It called again. He listened, not just to the sound, but to the space it left after. The silence that followed was thick, like earth soaked in meaning. He reached down and placed one hand flat on the ground. Not to test it, not to read it, simply to touch. The soil was cooler than the day's fields, cooler than the dug plots where sunlight had sunk deep. It held a different kind of stillness, a stillness undisturbed by purpose. He thought of the seeds resting in their baskets near his shelter. They would wait. They would not mind, they did not hunger for the ground. They trusted him to know when. And if he never placed them here, they would sleep until they were offered another home. The moon passed overhead, slow and quiet. Its light gathered along the lines of his hands, tracing each wrinkle, each scar, each curve of effort left by years of digging. The lines told stories. Not loud ones, gentle ones. Stories of days when things grew, of days when they didn't, of seasons filled with wonder, and seasons filled with the slow ache of repetition. And now, in this moment, the light turned those stories into silver. He leaned back and sat fully on the earth, legs stretched out, palms behind him, holding him steady. The grasses around him whispered as they bent in the breeze. He tilted his head and looked across the unturned plot. It seemed larger in the dark, its shape more mysterious, as though it had widened while he wasn't watching. It reminded him of a face not yet familiar, of something sacred he had nearly forgotten to meet. There had been years when he rushed, years when every patch of earth had to be claimed, named, transformed, when untouched ground made him anxious, when bare soil felt like a question he didn't want to answer. But this year, everything had moved more slowly. Not from weakness, not from weariness, but from something deeper, an understanding that time was not his to command, that the field would not vanish if he rested beside it first. That growth could come from stillness too. The owl called again, and he turned his head toward the sound. A flutter passed above him, low and broad-winged, brushing the air without resistance. He watched the movement fade into the dark. Then he looked down again at the ground, at the pale stalks caught in moonlight, at the pebbles nestled in dust, at the space where the soil waited without needing to be changed. And he felt a warmth rise in his chest, not from the air, not from his own body, but from the way the silence held him. Gently, firmly, like roots holding stone. He lowered his head and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel more closely the way the earth curved under his spine, the way the wind moved around his arms, the way the night wrapped itself around his breath without asking questions. He stayed like that for a long time, unmoving, unneeded by anything. The moon passed on. The owl fell, silent. Even the breeze quieted, and still he did not rise. The unturned ground held him, not because it asked for something, but because it knew he had nothing left to give tonight. And still it welcomed him. And still it waited. Dawn arrived in silence, soft and feathered. It pulled itself across the land like mist moving low along the valley floor, brushing gently against stalk and stone. The first farmer rose as he always did, not from alarm, not from duty, but from some inner movement that knew when to meet the morning. He sat for a time at the edge of his shelter, letting the cool air settle into his bones, letting the light press against his skin in hushes rather than bursts. There was no hurry. There never was. The world turned slowly, and the field followed. He walked the path that curled beside the barley rows, the stones beneath his feet smooth from long use, the air still carrying the scent of night. Insects stirred. Leaves rustled. Birds called low from the thorn trees at the far edge. The ground here had begun to darken, the rain, from 3 nights before, finally sinking deep enough to change its voice. When he stepped across the furrows, they held a weight they hadn't before, a memory of water clinging just beneath the surface. He knelt and pressed his palm flat against the soil. It welcomed him. Not wet, not dry, ready. He was on his way to clear the stream path. A simple task, familiar and rhythmic. The reed-choked trench needed to be swept clear to allow water to reach the lower plots, and though there was no promise of more rain, he knew that what had been given needed guidance. His digging stick leaned against the post near the tamarisk, and he took it in hand as he passed, fingers curling around the smoothed wood like returning to an old conversation. As he reached the narrow bend in the path just before the stream, he paused. There, across the compacted dust, a line of ants moved. Steady, deliberate, unbothered. They formed a perfect winding trail, wide enough to notice, narrow enough to miss if one moved too quickly. Hundreds of them, perhaps more, each carrying something. Crumbs of husk, grains of soil, fragments of something unseen. They moved with intention but not urgency. Their small feet left no trace, but their presence altered the path entirely. The first farmer stopped, not in hesitation but in observation. His own feet stilled. The digging stick hung loosely in his hand, its blade brushing against his ankle. He crouched slowly, squinting into the low light of morning. The ants paid him no mind. They continued, each one knowing only its next step, each one committed to its unseen task. He watched the slow tide of them ripple across the dust, an unbroken bridge of motion. He could have stepped over, could have walked around, could have finished his work and returned before they even reached the other side. But he didn't. He remained there, crouched beside them, eyes tracing the curve of their line as it moved toward the hollow where the reeds grew thick. He placed the stick on the ground beside him, gently, like laying down something sacred. The ants crossed without pause, brushing against the smooth shaft of wood as if it had always been there. He wondered how long their journey would last, if they knew, if they cared, or if they moved simply because they had chosen this path and were too far along to stop. He shifted his weight and sat, legs crossed, elbows resting on his knees. A breeze moved through the grass, and the sky above had begun to brighten. The sun would come soon. The work would wait. He watched as one ant, smaller than the others, dropped its burden, something too large for its size, and returned without it. Another ant took the task in stride. The line did not break. He felt his breath slow, matching the rhythm of the march. He remembered, faintly, a lesson from his youth. His grandfather crouched beside him near the field's edge, pointing toward a row of ants moving along a broken pottery shard. "Watch them," he had said, "not because they are strong, but because they are certain." He hadn't understood it then. He barely understood it now, but he could feel the meaning in his chest as he sat with the line. The digging stick remained beside him, forgotten for the moment. A bird sang out overhead, its song clear and short, then silent. The sun rose enough to cast a pale gold along the edges of the field, and the light touched the ants' backs in a shimmer. He leaned forward slightly, elbows pressed against thighs, eyes soft with focus. The ants turned slightly, adjusting their path to curve around a small clump of grass. Not resisting, not hesitating, just adjusting. A gentle shift, a quiet agreement. The farmer's thoughts turned not toward the fields, nor toward the water trench that waited, but toward the curve itself. The way the ants responded, not with effort, but with ease. They did not complain, they did not pause to argue. They moved with the earth, not against it. He wondered how many of his own steps had been taken out of force instead of flow. How often he had pressed when he should have yielded. The ants moved on. Some disappeared into the undergrowth. Others emerged, carrying new burdens. The line lengthened, then thinned. The path beneath them bore no mark, but he would remember its shape long after they were gone. He remained seated until the last of them had passed. It took the better part of the hour. The sun had climbed halfway up the sky by then, and the warmth had begun to press gently against his shoulders. Still, he did not move. The digging stick remained on the ground beside him, untouched. When the path cleared, he did not rise immediately. Instead, he looked at where they had been, the narrow, winding road they had made, which now faded back into plain dust. Nothing remained, not a line, not a mark. Only his memory of their movement, only the rhythm they had left behind in the quiet echo of his chest. Then he stood, slowly, without stiffness, as if his bones had also been listening. He picked up the stick and brushed off the light film of dust. The trench still needed clearing. The reeds still tangled the water's path. But the urgency had gone. The work would come. First, he took one step forward, then another, and before long, his own rhythm returned. The trench met him like an old friend, the reeds tall and dry, whispering softly as he approached. He began to work, not quickly, not slowly, just in time with the breath he had gathered while the ants crossed. Each stroke of the digging stick moved a little more of the world than the last, and the memory of that small winding path remained just beneath his feet, as if waiting to be walked again. By the time the sun had passed its middle, the first farmer had already made his slow descent toward the riverbed. He did not walk quickly, nor with the determined stride of someone going to fetch or fix. There was no urgency in his steps, just gravity, patience, and the pull of memory. The earth had grown quiet that day, not from stillness, but from a kind of listening that pressed into every surface. Even the birds had softened their calls, and the wind, when it came, moved as though afraid to break something delicate in the air. The river was not far. A winding walk past the edge of the barley fields, through the narrow path where acacia thorns caught on his sleeves and low grasses brushed against his ankles. He moved with care, as he always did when nearing the water. Not because it was dangerous, but because it was sacred. A place older than the fields, older even than the stories his grandmother used to tell him by firelight, when her hands traced rivers in the air and her voice lowered for the parts she didn't want the wind to carry. The sky overhead held a pale gold, the edges of the day beginning to dull. When he reached the river's edge, he stood for a long time, watching. The water moved, slow, shallow, and silver, but it did not speak. It carried no sound, no shimmer of voice. It ran like thought, smooth, quiet, endless. He stepped closer, boots pressing into the soft silt, and crouched low, letting his fingers hover just above the surface. The current slipped by, unfazed. He placed one hand in, then the other. The water was cool but not cold. It received him without question, but it did not offer anything in return. He had come here before in times of confusion, of turning seasons, when the sky gave too little or too much, when seeds rebelled, when nights grew too long. And often the river had answered, not in words, not in signs, but in feelings, a shift in the wind, a ripple in the water, a frog that surfaced beside him, a leaf that turned and spun and drifted toward him as if guided. But today, nothing moved except what already had. He stayed there, knees bent, the skin of his forearms damp from the water, eyes fixed on the middle current that glided, like silver thread drawn across dark cloth. The light shifted, shadows lengthening on the opposite bank, reeds swaying in soft patterns. The frogs did not sing. The insects did not rise. Only the water moved, and even that seemed hesitant. He sat back slowly on the riverbank, arms resting loosely over his knees, and exhaled through his nose. It was not disappointment he felt, nor frustration, just a kind of ache that had no edges, the ache of wanting an answer and receiving only presence. He watched the current. He watched the stones beneath it, round, smooth, unmoved. They had lived there for years, maybe longer. They did not push against the water, they accepted it, shaped it even. Not by resistance, but by staying. He reached down and lifted one of the smaller stones from the edge. It was heavier than it looked. It rested in his palm like a thought that had taken form. He turned it over, watched the droplets slide down its back, then placed it back where it had come from. The river moved on. No change, no pause. Just the endless motion of something ancient and unbothered. He leaned forward and cupped water in both hands, brought it to his face, let it run down his cheeks and beard. It left behind no message, no vision, no new knowing. But it cooled the skin, softened the eyes, reminded him of being small. When he was a child, he had believed the river knew everything, that it could tell the future, hold secrets, guide hands. He used to whisper questions into the current and watch for answers in the pattern of its ripples. His mother had caught him once, kneeling at the bend and speaking as if to a friend. She hadn't laughed. She had only said, "Sometimes rivers speak. But more often they hold silence for you, so you can hear yourself more clearly." And now, sitting again at the bend where reeds gathered in soft thickets and dragonflies occasionally danced, he wondered if this, too, was that kind of silence. He let his eyes close for a while, letting the hush settle into his shoulders. The warmth of the day had begun to soften. The sun hung low now, caught in the arms of the hills, and the shadows along the bank stretched longer and darker. His hands, resting in his lap, felt dry again, and he rubbed one thumb over the other slowly, tracing the calluses that had shaped over seasons, softened by water and work. A bird landed on the far side of the river, small, black, with a pale eye. It did not sing, just watched, just stood. And then it left. He smiled faintly at that. Even the birds were quiet today, as if they too had come with questions and found only reflection. He leaned forward once more. this time to trail his fingers across the surface of the water, not cupping it, not holding, just touching. The current didn't quicken or pull. It slid past him as indifferent as breath. And still, no answer came, no sign, no sudden change in wind, no shift in clouds. But beneath the silence there was something else, something so small it barely touched the edge of thought. A hum, not sound, not vibration, just a knowing. That the river didn't have to answer to be with him, that its presence was its gift, that not everything must speak to be understood. He stood slowly, knees creaking, ankles stiff. The breeze returned as he did, brushing past him on its way up the bank. He looked once more at the surface. The river kept moving, kept traveling, kept carrying light across its skin. And he understood, in some small, quiet place, that this was what rivers did. Not answer, not explain, just continue. He turned away from the bank and began the slow walk back through the reeds. The digging stick he'd brought with him rested against a tree trunk. He picked it up, more from habit than need. The sun was almost gone. The first stars blinked overhead. Somewhere behind him, the river whispered its long song, and even though it had given him nothing, he felt full. He walked with the kind of silence that doesn't beg to be broken, that soft, reverent stillness that comes only after waiting for something that never arrives, and realizing that maybe it didn't need to. And as the sky deepened and the crickets returned to their singing, the first farmer walked on, holding nothing, asking nothing, needing nothing. Because even when the river didn't answer, it had still been there. And that was enough. Morning had already begun to warm the skin of the earth when the first farmer opened his eyes. The night had left no chill behind, only the softness of a breeze that curled like steam from a warming bowl. He rose slowly, the familiar creaks in his knees and shoulders reminding him of his own seasons, of joints turned to hinges over years of patient bending. Outside his shelter, the day met him without fanfare. No rain, no wind, no song. Just light, soft and pale, settling over the edges of the field like dust over a sleeping pot. He moved through his tasks with quiet hands. He checked the grain baskets, brushed away the fine threads of spiders from the storage hut's lintel, poured the morning water into the clay cup that had belonged to his mother. There was a rhythm to these small actions, each one a line in a quiet hymn that only the field could hum along to. The barley stalks had begun to rise, just barely, just enough to catch the early sun and turn gold at the tips. It had taken time, much more than usual, but they were rising now. Not because they had been called, but because something inside them had decided the moment had arrived. He walked the path around the field's edge, letting his feet move without thinking, his body tracing a curve it had known for longer than memory. The soil was still damp in places where the last rain had pooled, but much of it was dry again, cracked just slightly at the surface like lips waiting for words. He touched the ground with his toes, his fingers, his breath. Everything returned its silence to him, and he accepted it like one receives the long pause in a conversation that no longer needs sound. It was near the old stone, the one that marked nothing but always watched, where he first saw the bird. At first it was only a shape in the corner of his vision, something still, something dark, something small. But when he turned his head, there it was, perched on the low limb of a withered branch. A small thing, brown with a single white stripe above one eye, chest puffed slightly, feathers ragged at the edge as if it had flown too far. The first farmer stopped. He did not step forward. He did not blink. He only looked. The bird did not move. He had seen this bird before, or one like it, seasons ago, perhaps longer. It had once made its home in the old tree that now stood silent near the edge of the fields. the tree he had sat beneath when the sun grew too much. He remembered its calls, sharp, rhythmic, not melodic but insistent. It had followed him sometimes as he walked the rows, hopping from stalk to stalk, as though curious about his hands or his shadow. Then it had vanished one day. No call, no trace, just gone. He hadn't looked for it. He'd simply noticed its absence and carried on with the work. But now it was here again. He did not smile, not quite, but his eyes softened. He took one slow step forward, then another, careful not to startle. But the bird did not fly. It watched him, head slightly tilted, chest lifting with each breath. He crouched low, knees pressing into the earth, and kept his gaze steady. The bird said nothing. No song, no trill, no flutter of wings. It just stayed. And in that stillness the first farmer felt something shift, something small and deep, like a pebble adjusting at the bottom of a stream. He had not realized how much he had missed the sound of wings. He stayed like that for a long while, crouched near the bird, letting the air move slowly between them. Around them, the field began to warm. The insects returned to their murmurs. The leaves whispered in the breeze that had finally woken. And still, the bird did not move. It did not sing. It only remained. Eventually, he lowered himself to the ground, crossing his legs and resting his hands in his lap. He looked away from the bird now, not out of disinterest but out of reverence. Sometimes, watching too long is a kind of asking, and he did not wish to ask. He only wished to be near. He listened to the hum of the grasses, to the gentle squeak of reeds rubbing together along the irrigation trench. He thought of how many mornings he had walked this path alone, how many evenings he had ended the day beside the fire, the wind carrying only the sound of silence. And now, in the simplest form, something had returned. Perhaps it was the same bird, perhaps not. Perhaps it had only chosen his field again, or perhaps it had remembered something he did not. He would not ask, he would not test its meaning, its presence was enough. After some time the bird stretched its wings once, slowly, without urgency, then pulled them in again. It shifted its feet on the branch and blinked, that was all. But in that moment something in the air around him eased. A knot he hadn't known he'd tied loosened in his chest. He did not cry. There were no tears, only breath. A deeper breath than he'd taken in weeks. The bird hopped once along the branch, turned its back, and looked toward the sky. Then, without any signal or sound, it flew. Not high, not far, just from branch to stone. And then to the fence, then out toward the tree line, its wings catching light as they moved, flashing briefly with gold. He watched it go. He stayed seated, letting the moment stretch, letting the warmth of it remain even as the bird's shape disappeared behind a cluster of elder shrubs. The field around him glowed now, the barley trembling in the soft breeze, shadows folding gently around the stone. The sky was the color of cracked wheat. And something in him, something quiet and long buried, stirred. Not everything that returns needs to stay. Not everything that stays needs to speak. Some things, when they return, simply remind us that we are not forgotten. He rose slowly, brushing soil from his palms, and stood beside the old stone once more. The fields were beginning to move now. Insects flew, the sun stretched, the wind braided itself between the rows. He walked again, not hurried, not slow, just as he always had. But today, the walk felt different, lighter. He reached the edge of the field and looked once more toward the place where the bird had flown. There was nothing there now, only the barley, only the breeze, only the knowing that something had returned, and, for a while, had chosen to stay. The days had begun to lean longer into evening, and the first farmer felt it in the way the light softened earlier and the air held its warmth a little longer across his skin. The sky no longer bled sharp orange at dusk, but turned quietly gold, then gray, like breath fading from glass. Everything around him had slowed. Not stopped, never stopped, but changed shape, as if time itself had settled into a deeper rhythm. And he, too, had changed with it. Not with purpose, not even with awareness, but slowly, in the way hills wear smooth beneath the wind, in the way a field grows familiar under the passing of years. He rose that morning with no plan, no tool waiting, no task unfinished. The barley had begun its quiet stretch into maturity. The lentils had broken ground in their hesitant way. Even the shaded patch beneath the acacia had stirred, soft green fingers reaching upward without ceremony. The fields did not need his hand today, or maybe they did, but not in the way they once had. There were days now when he simply walked, not to work, not to shape, but to be among the things that had begun to grow without him. He passed the willow marker, now slightly bent from a season of wind. He didn't straighten it. He touched it once, gently, the way one brushes a sleeping shoulder. The field beyond it shimmered, not with color, but with knowing. He could feel it in the rows, in the spaces between sprouting and soil. A sense that the waiting had become more than a pause. It had become part of the place. He knelt at the edge of the fava plot and ran his hand along the top of the soil. The ground gave slightly, still warm from the sun, still breathing. He remembered the first day he had pressed seed into this place, how his fingers had trembled, how he had spoken aloud, asking the earth to remember him, to accept the shape of his hands. That was long ago. Now, the earth no longer needed reminding, and neither did he. There was a rhythm to all of it. To the way he walked the perimeter each morning, to the way he paused by the tree, to the way he stopped by the irrigation channel just to hear the slow trickle of yesterday's water moving through the reeds. At first, those rhythms had been habits born from hope, from uncertainty, from the need to know that something would come if he waited. But now they were no longer waiting. They were the way. He sat on the stone near the tamarisk, the one that always cooled slower than the others, and watched as a line of light spilled across the ground toward his toes. He didn't move. The sun moved for him. The air wrapped itself gently around his shoulders. The field hummed in the way fields do when nothing urgent asks for attention. A cricket chirped near his heel. The sound was round, small, steady. He let it fill the silence. He thought of the days he used to mark, when he would press a small pebbles into a notch by the shelter, one for each morning that passed without rain, each evening that ended with dry ground. He no longer counted like that. There was no longer a before to chase, nor an after to wait for. The days came, and he met them. Not because he had become wise, but because the land had taught him how not to rush, how not to measure life by what had or hadn't arrived. He looked across the rows, each line a breath, each sprout a small voice, and he realized he had stopped asking. Not because the questions had been answered, but because they no longer needed to be. The sprouting, the silence, the sun, the unspoken curve of each season, these things spoke louder than answers ever could. He rose and walked the path toward the eastern plot, the one he hadn't turned until Moonlight told him to. It had begun to grow now, slowly but surely. He did not rush there. He simply walked, letting the dirt cling to his soles, the grass brush against his ankles, the wind press lightly at his back. The rows here were uneven, rough in places, some sprouts taller than others, some still thinking. It didn't matter. They were coming in their own way, in their own time. He crouched near one of the newer shoots and placed his hand beside it in the soil. Not to test it, not to guide, just to be there. His fingers, older now, lined with sun and soil, matched the earth's tone in a way they hadn't years ago. They had changed together. Slowly, without announcement. The wait had become less of a pause and more of a pace. Not something endured, but something lived. He sat back, letting his legs stretch out, and watched the way the shadows began to shift across the field. They stretched long and soft now, like fingers tracing the back of a dream. The sky above had begun to pale into late afternoon. The wind had come back, soft but steady, carrying the scent of cracked grain and old water. He closed his eyes and listened, not for a sound, but for the shape of stillness, for the shape of time moving through breath instead of through hours. The field did not ask anything of him. It never had. He had asked of it, and for years it had answered, sometimes with green, sometimes with silence. But lately it had simply stood with him, each furrow like a memory, each plant like a reminder that waiting was not something he did, it was something he belonged to. He lay down in the row, back against the earth, arms open to the wide sky. A hawk passed overhead, wings slicing slow through the light. He watched it drift, barely moving. The breeze bent the tops of the grain in a long wave beside him, like a breath traveling across the skin of the land. His own breath slowed to match. For the first time in a long while, he did not think of the harvest. He did not wonder when it would come. He did not imagine what he would carry home. He simply felt the curve of the soil beneath him, the way it held his spine, the way it didn't care whether he worked or waited. And in that quiet curve, in the hush between wind and heartbeat, he knew. The waiting had ended. Not because the seeds had risen, not because the sky had spoken, but because the waiting itself had become a path, and he had learned how to walk it. The field no longer surprised him. That was not to say it had become dull, or that he had stopped noticing. Rather, it had settled into him so completely that its small changes, each new leaf, each shift in the wind's path, each rise of green from dry dust, felt like breath moving through his own lungs. He did not need to look to know what had grown. He did not need to ask to feel what was becoming. The stillness had taught him to see without looking, to know without reaching. The sky that morning was the color of cooled ash, soft and even, without threat or promise. The first farmer stood barefoot on the warm, sun-dried earth outside his shelter and felt the hush of the hour settle over his shoulders like a worn cloth. Birds called, but not urgently. The grasses swayed, but without asking. Everything felt as though it had found its rhythm, and that rhythm had slowed to the tempo of the land itself. He crossed the rows slowly, his path meandering without aim, yet each footfall placed exactly where it had always wanted to be. The furrows had softened since the rain. New shoots now leaned slightly into the wind. The barley heads were fattening, their gold just beginning to brighten at the tips. He ran his fingers lightly across them, not harvesting, not testing, just touching. The grain whispered as his hand passed. No longer waiting, no longer hiding, just being. He paused at the tree, the one that no longer spoke, and leaned against it gently. The bark pressed against his back, rough and familiar. The wind moved through its limbs in long, even strokes, and for a moment he closed his eyes and let it pass through him as well. The silence he used to search for had grown vast and full. It no longer came in pockets or moments. It was everywhere now, under his skin, in his bones, along the path of his breath. He thought, distantly, of the younger version of himself, the man who had knelt and spoken to seeds as if they would only grow if they heard the right words. He remembered the rush, the measuring of days, the small griefs of failed sprouts and forgotten rains. He remembered standing in fields, expecting the earth to speak first. How long it had taken him to learn that silence was not refusal, that it was, in fact, an invitation. The stillness had changed him, not with answers but with space. It had given him mornings where he rose without a question, afternoons where his hands moved for the joy of motion alone, evenings where the wind carried nothing but itself. It had taught him that being quiet and being empty were not the same, that the field, in all its hush and hushes, held more than he had ever asked for. At the edge of the eastern plot he sat down. The unturned ground, which he had once visited only beneath moonlight, was now full of scattered green. Not neat rows, not planned crops. Wild things, stray shoots, weeds with flowers, the chaos of grace. He let his hand fall to the earth beside him, fingers brushing the roots of something he had not planted, and he smiled, not from amusement, but from understanding. That not everything needed his hand, that the land remembered how to grow without him. The sun reached its arc, casting long rays across the field. The stone he once sat on near the tamarisk gleamed faintly in the light, and he could see from a distance the shadow it cast. Shorter now, softer. He did not go to it. He simply watched. It was enough to know it was there, just as the river was still flowing, somewhere beyond the reeds, just as the ants, invisible now, surely crossed another path, just as the bird that had returned might one day return again. He closed his eyes and listened, not for anything, but to everything. The hush of grain, the hum of soil, the pulse of a world that did not need noise to feel alive. He could have remained like that forever, folded into the field, breath matching wind, heartbeat echoing the rhythm of seed and stem. When he opened his eyes, the light had shifted. Shadows reached farther now. The wind had cooled. A quiet chill, not from cold, but from the knowing that the day had turned its head. He stood slowly, letting his knees stretch and his spine unfurl, and looked out over the place that had held him through every kind of waiting. There was no fear in his body, no hunger in his mind, only the stillness. He walked back through the rows, not to tend, not to count, but to feel the earth beneath him, to let his feet remember what had changed. The field whispered again as he passed, and this time he understood. It did not thank him, it did not say farewell, it simply continued, as it always had, as it always would. And he walked on, not seeking anything, because what the stillness had given him was not something to carry, it was a way to walk, a way to stay, a way to wait without wanting, a way to be part of the land, and no longer apart from it.